Voters in Ontario have re-elected a progressive Conservative majority government. Our CBC News decision desk was able to make the call. Doug Ford will remain, of course, Premier of Ontario. He saw the province through the challenges of the pandemic, but concerns around affordability and the rising cost of living really dominated much of this campaign. So, what does his win tell us about where voters are? Are there lessons for other federal parties here? It's Thursday, and the At Issue panel is here. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia and Elamin Abdelmahmoud. During the break, I was saying probably the least surprising result in the most dull campaign we've seen in a while. Chantal, let's start with you on what you make of the results and Doug Ford's victory tonight.
Well, like you, I am totally shocked and surprised by this result, which every poll had predicted for weeks. No, seriously, 2 points. The first, to the Conservatives who are watching this, the federal Conservatives, Doug Ford did not win re-election on the back of Justin Trudeau's government. Actually, Justin Trudeau's Liberals were barely part of the rhetoric of anyone in this campaign. And Premier Ford spent the days leading up to the campaign making announcements side by side with Justin Trudeau. So for anyone who believes that there's enough rancor with Justin Trudeau to win an election on his bad name, quote unquote, there's a message there. Second, on the affordability issue, I'm not sure this is a real test of where people are. I think there is a delay between what's happening on that front and the electorate's mood and its willingness to blame incumbents for what's happening. So I wouldn't take that victory to the bank if I were campaigning in 6, 9, 12 months.
Andrew, what do you make of it, the fact that he was able to pull off another majority, too? So no real punishment from voters about anything that he may have done.
Yeah, well, he had help. I mean, the three leaders combined and conspired to make this the dullest campaign I can recall, with no defining issues, really no major platform planks of any note. When a buck-a-ride transit is the most memorable policy in the whole campaign, it tells you how dull it was. But with Ford, at least, it was deliberate. I mean, It was Conservative strategy to make this as tedious a campaign as possible, to make him as inaccessible as possible, because they wanted to rob the opposition of any kind of flashpoint. They wanted to make him as inoffensive and unfrightening as possible, because that way the opposition can't rally around one or the other of the parties. Mm-hmm. That was a project that had been going on for some years. He'd come in as the big disruptor, the elephant in the room, the guy who didn't obey any of the rules, had a very bad first couple of years and got that knocked out of him. And so when the pandemic came along and there was that usual rallying around the flag effect that we saw many governments enjoy, he also, if I can say, rose to the moment to some extent, if not in policy terms, where there was the usual blundering that I think occurred with all the governments, but he at least came across as empathetic and engaged, and having lowered expectations so much before then, that seemed to be enough.
Althia, I mean, if you talk to Conservatives, they also say that Doug Ford is good at saying that he made a mistake, and that helped too people to, be able to forgive him and move on, as they have clearly tonight.
Yeah, I think that's true. Abacus Data had an interesting figure out earlier this week that said that 1 out of every 5 people who voted for Justin Trudeau in 2021, so just last fall, will be voting for Doug Ford in this election. There's a lot of voter overlap. But I think the most important thing is what Andrew said. Like, the voters did not fear Doug Ford. So while, yes, a majority of Ontario voters did not want to see a Doug Ford government reelected, the parties are split. Frankly, they didn't do a good enough job to put issues in front of people to make them care, to make them go out to vote. If the numbers that we were seeing earlier in the day are accurate, I mean, the voter turnout is remarkably low. But I think, the other point to this is for federal Conservatives, the message really, I believe, is you should not be making your campaign against vaccines and against lockdowns, because that is actually not where the majority of the people are. And when you look at Pierre Poilievre's campaign, for example, it's hard to see how he can pivot back to be at a place where the majority of the country is.
Right, especially if Ontario is so vote rich for federal elections, obviously. Elamin, your take on
precisely
what Doug Ford did here tonight?
I mean, I think what Doug Ford did shows that any pivot back is possible. It was just a year ago that we were talking about Doug Ford suggesting that playgrounds be closed and the police sort of be given expanded powers to stop anybody on the street while at the same time factories were open. I think what the results tonight sort of show that with a little bit of message discipline, maybe in the 8 or 9 months leading up to the election, because this really has been this new leaf of Doug Ford really only started probably September or so, has been really focused on this sort of affordability message. And it seems to have erased most of the bad will that had kind of built up before that. And I think that message is really important, this idea of message discipline. And then the other thing is, voters repeatedly said that housing is really important to them. Voters repeatedly said that climate change is really important to them. The results don't necessarily bear that out. You have the NDP and the Liberals in Ontario both committing to the task force's sort of goal line of a certain number of houses, affordable houses to be built in the next 10 years. Doug Ford's party is the only one that did not commit to meet that task force. They are the winners tonight. So what people say that they want to vote on and what they do end up voting on does not always end up aligning.
I wonder if part of that, though, Chantal, is that people in Ontario know that the federal Liberals have made commitments on housing and climate change, and whether that ends up comforting them. And then talk to me about what the other leaders have done here, because clearly they have not done well tonight.
You mean what they've not done? I'm not so sure that reassurance came from federal policies on both scores, but and there has been a pattern of voters, a plurality of voters opting for governments that are really not scoring very highly on climate change. Just look at Quebec. François Legault did not even have a section of his platform on climate change when he won a majority mandate last time. I would also note that Ontarians routinely give second terms to incumbents. There has been an exception, and he would hate me for mentioning it. It's called Bob Rae. But if you look at the history of the province, this is a province that, as opposed to others in Atlantic Canada, Quebec, does tend to stick with the incumbent at least for another term. My final point would be a fairly easy re-election campaign, and I think that is what it was, in part because maybe after 4 campaigns, this was the 4th one for Andrea Horwath of the NDP. Voters felt that if they'd said no 3 times, they hadn't seen enough that convinced them to change their minds. And I think the Liberal leader was relatively unknown and not particularly impressive on the campaign trail. But beware that an easy re-election campaign does not necessarily lead to an easy second term. Sometimes maybe the opposite. Without the pandemic to crowd out every other mistake, it may be rough going.
I think you should expect an email from Bob Rae. Andrew, do you agree with that the next term might be bumpy, or it could be more challenging anyway?
Well, yeah, particularly because he doesn't really have a mandate to do anything. The good news about the Doug Ford administration was that he ditched the populism, he ditched the turmoil of the first 2 years. The bad news is he also ditched any defining conservative agenda. This is a big spending, big taxing, deficit-happy government, virtually indistinguishable from the government that went before it in that regard. And he didn't really promise to do much serious policy in the next 4 years. So, yeah, he's got a blank slate. That's good, I suppose, from the standpoint of freedom of movement, but it's not very good from the standpoint of not having a mandate. Remember what happened the first time when he said, we can balance the budget by not making any cuts, but just by efficiencies. Then he starts making cuts and people rightly scream blue murder because you never sought a mandate for any of that.
Yeah. Althia, what does it say about the other parties, the NDP and the Liberals here? And I mean, I guess it's vote splitting, but also weakness of the leaders in selling themselves, as you said earlier.
And the fact that our electoral system does not accurately reflect what the will of the people is. I mean, you could say that about nearly every election. It is rather shocking, frankly, that and I don't know what the numbers are because I've turned the TV off yet, but if the polls are accurate, that the majority of people did not want to have Doug Ford reelected, and here he is with a majority government. And you could say that about, the Trudeau Liberals in the last fall as well. But when you look at actually both the NDP and the Liberals platforms, they're quite similar why do we have two center-left parties that are splitting the votes and allowing a center-right party, but to Andrew's point, that likes to spend a lot? Why are voters doing this to themselves, and how long will they tolerate that? To me, that is still a conundrum. 20 years after starting covering politics, I find this baffling.
Elamin?
Well, at least federally, I thought the 2015 election was supposed to be the last election that was held under the first past the post.
Don't bring that up again.
That turned out to be just a rumor. I think the broader point for me as I sort of watch these numbers come in is, the Liberal brand in Ontario. One would have thought that, sure, maybe 2018 was a moment of punishment after a long time of the Liberal rule. But these numbers have to be sort of way below what the Liberals were expecting because, frankly, one would have expected they at least would get back to the 20s somewhere. But maybe it's early on yet in the night. But the fact that we're so easily be able to call a PC majority government this early in the night is probably not a good sign for that brand. Stephen Del Duca sort of ran on the promise of restoring that brand to at least what it was before 2018. I have to imagine that he does not think of his job as particularly safe.
Well, and so Stephen Del Duca has actually lost his seat tonight. So I don't know what that says about him or the Liberal brand, Chantal. Certainly nothing great.
Well, it says something about the poor ground game and poor strategic choices. But if you look carefully at what's happening in this country, the Liberal brand provincially is in trouble. Ontario. Look at polls in Quebec with an election coming and what's happening to the Liberal Party, and then go west, no real Liberal Party of any strength in the prairies. And then you get to BC where the Liberal Party, every time you mention it, someone sends you an email to say they're not really Liberals, you know. They're actually the social credit that has taken the name of the Liberal Party. So you're basically saying that from Atlantic Canada to the Pacific Coast, the Liberal brand at the provincial level is weaker and weaker, including in the two larger provinces of Ontario and Quebec. And that is an interesting development, which will likely lead to some changes. To Althia's point, why don't they get along? The main reason the NDP and the Liberals have trouble getting along federally when they should is because there's so much bad blood in Ontario between the Liberals and the New Democrats provincially.
I only have about a minute, Andrew, so you can take what you need there.
Well, to be fair to the opposition parties, the unemployment rate in Ontario is 5.3%. Now, Doug Ford had very little to do with that, but if you're in opposition, you're always going to be rowing uphill with that kind of economy. And similarly, we saw in several provinces, incumbent governments were returned during the pandemic. People, I think with some justice said, look, this was a big, messy thing that nobody really got their arms around. There was all kinds of mistakes made in every province, and people judged them more on what kind of leadership they showed, whether they were able, as I say, to connect to people and show that they cared about it, rather than did you actually fix the problem. I should say Ontario had one of the more stringent regimes in the country on COVID. They got people knocking them for being too loose, but in compared to other provinces, they had one of the tighter ones. And the main thing that achieved for Doug Ford was to make him look mainstream.
Okay, I gotta end it there. I'm so glad when you guys are here on election nights, wherever they happen. Thank you all for your smart observations. Appreciate it. And with that, I'll send things back to Andrew in Toronto.